The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Highgrove House as Charles stood alone in what had once been Diana's private study. 26 years had passed since her death, yet he rarely entered this room. The staff had preserved it exactly as she left it, dust covers protecting furniture that held too many memories. Today was different. Charles had received a call from his estate manager about renovations needed throughout the house. Every room would be updated except this one, unless he gave permission. Standing there now, surrounded by Diana's belongings, he felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. Her writing desk sat by the window, elegant and untouched. Diana had spent countless hours there, writing letters to friends, charity organizations, and supporters around the world. The desk drawers had been locked since her passing, the key lost somewhere in the chaos that followed that terrible night in Paris. Charles approached the desk slowly, his fingers trailing along its polished surface. He remembered watching Diana write there during their troubled marriage, her blonde head bent over paper, completely absorbed in her thoughts. Back then, he had been too proud and too hurt to ask what she was writing. Now, curiosity and something deeper drove him forward. The locksmith had come that morning, a quiet man who asked no questions as he carefully opened each drawer. Charles had waited until the house was empty, dismissing the staff for the afternoon. Whatever he found here, he wanted to face alone. The first drawer contained the expected items: elegant pens, royal letterhead, photographs of William and Harry as young boys. But it was the second drawer that made his breath catch. Hidden beneath a silk scarf was a leather-bound book he had never seen before. The cover was deep blue, worn smooth by countless touches with no title or marking to indicate its contents. Charles lifted the diary with trembling hands. The leather felt warm, as if Diana had just been holding it. He opened to the first page and saw her familiar handwriting. The loops and curves he remembered from birthday cards and notes she used to leave around the house during their brief happy period. The first entry was dated just 3 months after their wedding. Charles settled into Diana's chair, his heart pounding as he began to read her private thoughts from those early days of their marriage. "I thought I understood what it meant to be royal," Diana had written. "The ceremonies, the protocol, the endless engagements. But no one prepared me for the loneliness. Charles seems so distant, even when we're in the same room. I catch him staring at photographs of Camilla when he thinks I'm not looking. I pretend not to notice, but each time it feels like a small death inside my chest." Charles closed his eyes, remembering those early months. He had been struggling too, torn between duty and desire, between the woman he had married and the woman he truly loved. But reading Diana's words now, he realized how completely he had failed to see her pain. He turned the page and continued reading. Entry after entry revealed Diana's growing isolation, her desperate attempts to connect with him, and her confusion about her new role. She wrote about their honeymoon, describing moments Charles had forgotten entirely. "Today Charles showed me the gardens at Balmoral," one entry read. "For a brief moment I saw the man I thought I was marrying. He was gentle, almost shy, as he explained how his grandmother had planted the roses. I wanted to take his hand, to tell him how beautiful it all was, but something held me back. There's always something between us, invisible but solid as a wall." The words cut through Charles like a blade. He remembered that day, remembered wanting to reach out to her but feeling awkward and uncertain. He had been raised to hide emotions, to maintain composure at all costs. Diana had been young, open, eager for connection, and he had failed her from the very beginning. As he read on, Charles discovered entries about their public appearances together. Diana described the crowds, the overwhelming attention, the pressure to always smile and wave. But she also wrote about her growing confidence, her realization that she could make a difference in people's lives. "The children at the hospital today looked at me with such hope," she had written. "Not because I'm royal, but because I was really seeing them, really listening. Charles thinks my involvement is too emotional, not dignified enough. But how can dignity matter more than compassion? These children need love, not distance." Charles felt tears burning his eyes. He had criticized her approach, calling it too informal, too personal. He had been afraid her warmth would somehow diminish the monarchy's authority. Now he could see how wrong he had been, how her gift for genuine connection had actually strengthened the royal family's bond with the public. The diary entries grew more painful as months turned into years. Diana wrote about their growing arguments, about feeling trapped in a marriage that existed more for public consumption than private happiness. She described nights lying awake beside him, feeling more alone than she ever had as a single woman. "I try to talk to Charles about my feelings," one entry revealed, "but he shuts down completely. He says I'm being too dramatic, too emotional. Maybe he's right. Maybe there's something wrong with me for wanting more than this beautiful prison we've built together." Charles had to stop reading. The diary fell closed in his lap as he buried his face in his hands. He had called her dramatic, had dismissed her need for emotional intimacy as weakness. Now, reading her private thoughts, he could see that her emotions hadn't been weakness at all. They had been her greatest strength, the source of her ability to touch hearts and change lives. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. Charles sat in Diana's chair holding her diary, finally understanding the depth of pain he had caused the woman who had given him two wonderful sons and had tried so hard to love him. The room felt heavy with memories and regret. Charles knew he had to keep reading, had to face whatever other truths Diana had written in these pages, but for now he needed a moment to absorb what he had already learned. The woman he had divorced, the woman who had died so young, had been far wiser and stronger than he had ever realized, and he was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had both lost. 3 days had passed since Charles first opened Diana's diary. He had barely slept, barely eaten, his mind consumed by her words. The diary sat on his nightstand like a presence, calling to him even when he tried to focus on other matters. His staff had begun to worry about his distraction during official engagements, but Charles couldn't bring himself to care about protocol when Diana's truth was finally being revealed. He returned to her study on a quiet Sunday morning, when the house was still except for the distant sounds of kitchen preparations. The diary seemed to pulse with life as he opened it to where he had left off, marking his place with a photograph of Diana with infant William. The entries from William's birth revealed a side of their marriage Charles had forgotten. Diana wrote about those precious weeks when they had seemed like a real family, when Charles had been gentle and attentive, genuinely excited about fatherhood. "Charles held William for hours today," Diana had written. "I watched him whisper stories about the royal lineage, about duty and honor, but his voice was so tender. For the first time since our wedding, I felt hopeful about our future. Maybe this baby will bridge the gap between us. Maybe love can grow from shared purpose." Charles remembered those days differently. He recalled feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility, worried about raising a future king while his own marriage was struggling. But Diana had seen hope where he had seen only pressure. She had believed they could build something beautiful together, even when their foundation was already cracking. The entries continued through William's early months, documenting both joy and growing tension. Diana wrote about the sleepless nights, the challenges of new motherhood, and her increasing frustration with royal protocols that kept her from being the hands-on mother she wanted to be. "The nannies are wonderful, but they follow Charles's instructions more than mine," she had written. "He wants William raised with proper distance, prepared for royal duty from infancy. But William is a baby, not a future king. He needs cuddles and lullabies, not lessons in deportment. I feel like I'm fighting for my own child's soul." Charles winced as he read these words. He had indeed been focused on preparing William for his future role, believing that structure and discipline were more important than the emotional warmth Diana provided. Now he could see how his approach had pushed Diana further away, making her feel like an outsider in her own family. The diary entries grew more revealing as Diana wrote about discovering Camilla's continued presence in Charles's life. The pain in her words was overwhelming, each sentence a testament to betrayal and heartbreak. "I found letters today," Diana had written, her handwriting more hurried and emotional than usual. "Hidden in Charles's study, tied with a blue ribbon. Love letters from Camilla, some dated after our wedding. My hands shook as I read them. She knows everything about our private life, our struggles, our most intimate moments. Charles has been sharing our marriage with her, and I've been living a lie." Charles felt physically ill as he read Diana's account of that discovery. He remembered that day, remembered coming home to find Diana in tears, remembered the terrible fight that followed. But he had been so defensive, so angry at being caught, that he had never truly considered how devastating this betrayal must have been for her. Diana's entries about confronting him were even more painful. She described their arguments in detail, his denials and justifications, her growing realization that their marriage had been doomed from the start. But what struck Charles most was her persistent hope, even in the darkest moments. "I still believe Charles could choose our marriage if he really tried," she had written after one particularly brutal fight. "I see glimpses of the man he could be, moments when his guard drops and he's genuinely present with me. But Camilla's shadow falls across everything we do. How can I compete with a love that began before I even existed in his world?" Charles had to stop reading again. The diary revealed not just Diana's pain but her incredible generosity of spirit. Even as he was betraying her, she continued believing in their potential. She had been fighting for their marriage while he had been planning his escape. He turned to entries written during her pregnancy with Harry. Diana's joy at expecting another child was tempered by her growing certainty that Charles was emotionally unavailable. She wrote about his lack of involvement in the pregnancy, his apparent disappointment that the baby might be another son rather than a daughter. "Charles barely looks at my growing belly," she had written. "When I try to share my excitement about the baby's movements or the doctor's reports, he listens with the same polite attention he gives to boring state papers. This child deserves a father who wants him, not one who sees him as just another royal obligation." The entry about Harry's birth was particularly heartbreaking. Diana described her labor, her hope that Charles would be present and supportive, and her devastation when his first concern was whether the baby was healthy enough to fulfill royal duties someday. "Harry is perfect, beautiful with the sweetest temperament," Diana had written, but Charles held him like a stranger's child. He asked about genetic tests, about ensuring the succession was secure, but never once said he was proud or happy. "I realize then that I'm raising these boys essentially alone. Charles may be their father by blood, but I'm their only real parent." Charles set the diary aside and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens Diana had loved. He could picture her there with young William and Harry, laughing as they chased each other across the lawn. Those had been her moments of pure happiness, when royal protocol couldn't interfere with maternal love. Returning to the diary, Charles found entries about Diana's growing involvement with charitable causes. Her writing became more confident, more purposeful, as she discovered her unique ability to connect with people who were suffering. "The AIDS patients at the hospital today were so grateful for basic human contact," she had written. "When I held their hands, touched their faces, I could see hope returning to their eyes. Charles thinks I'm taking unnecessary risks, violating royal dignity. But how can dignity matter when people are dying alone and afraid? This is why I was put in this position. Not to cut ribbons and make small talk, but to bring love where it's desperately needed." These entries revealed Diana's transformation from confused young bride to confident humanitarian. She wrote about her work with landmine victims, homeless shelters, and children's hospitals. Each cause seemed to strengthen her sense of purpose and independence, but also widened the gap between her and Charles. "I'm becoming someone I never expected to be," one entry read. "Someone who can walk into a room full of strangers and make them feel seen and valued. Charles calls it showing off, seeking attention. He doesn't understand that this work fulfills me in ways our marriage never could. I'm finally using my royal position for something meaningful." Charles felt a complex mixture of pride and regret as he read about Diana's charitable work. Her compassion and dedication had indeed transformed the monarchy's relationship with the public. But his inability to support her mission had driven them further apart, making her success feel like criticism of his more traditional approach to royal duty. The fourth section of Diana's diary proved to be the most challenging for Charles. These entries, written during the final years of her life, revealed a woman who had found her own voice and purpose, but still carried deep wounds from their marriage. Diana wrote with increasing confidence about her humanitarian work, her role as a mother and her hopes for the future, but threads of sadness about their failed relationship wove through every page. Charles found himself reading late into the night, compelled by Diana's evolving perspective on their shared history. She had begun to analyze their relationship with remarkable insight, understanding patterns and dynamics that had escaped him even now, decades later. "I realize now that Charles and I were both victims of the system that brought us together," she had written 2 years after their divorce. "He was trained from birth to put duty before personal happiness, to maintain appearances rather than pursue authentic relationships. I was chosen because I fit a role, not because we were compatible as human beings. We were both trying to play parts we were never meant for." This perspective surprised Charles. During their bitter divorce proceedings, Diana had focused on his betrayals and failures. But here, in private, she showed a deeper understanding of the impossible situation they had both faced. She wasn't excusing his behavior, but she was trying to make sense of how two decent people had caused each other so much pain. The entries about William and Harry during this period revealed Diana's dedication to giving her sons what she and Charles had never had: emotional security and unconditional love. She wrote extensively about her parenting philosophy, her determination to raise boys who could express feelings and form healthy relationships. Took William and Harry to McDonald's today. One entry read, Charles would be horrified by the lack of protocol, but the boys were so happy to do something completely normal. William told me secrets over chicken nuggets that he would never share in a formal dining room. Harry fell asleep in my lap during the movie, something he couldn't do if we were always surrounded by staff and schedules. These moments of ordinary life are what I want them to remember. Charles felt a sharp pang of regret as he read about these simple pleasures. He had missed so many opportunities to connect with his sons, always prioritizing royal duties over paternal presence. Diana had understood what he was still learning, that being a good father mattered more than raising perfect future royals. The diary revealed Diana's ongoing struggle with media attention, but also her growing skill at using publicity for positive purposes. She wrote about carefully chosen appearances, strategic interviews, and calculated revelations designed to support her charitable causes. The landmine campaign needs more attention, she had written. The politicians won't act unless they feel public pressure. If I have to exploit my celebrity to save lives, then that's what I'll do. Charles always criticized my relationship with the media, but he never understood that I could turn their fascination into a force for good. Charles had indeed criticized Diana's media strategy, viewing it as undignified and attention-seeking. Now he could see her sophisticated understanding of how to leverage publicity for humanitarian purposes. She had been ahead of her time, recognizing that modern royalty needed to actively engage with media rather than simply enduring it. But the diary also revealed the personal cost of Diana's public life. She wrote about the constant scrutiny, the invasion of privacy, the difficulty of forming genuine friendships when everyone wanted something from her. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a fishbowl, she had written. Every relationship is complicated by my status. Every emotion is analyzed by photographers and journalists. I long for simple human connection, for people who see Diana the woman rather than Diana the royal. Charles never understood this burden because he was born into it. For him, the attention is normal. For me, it still feels like wearing clothes that don't fit. These entries helped Charles understand Diana's controversial decisions during their later years together and after their divorce. Her famous television interview, her revelations about their marriage, her public relationships. All of these had seemed vindictive and calculated to him. Now he realized they had been desperate attempts to control her own narrative, to be seen as a complete person rather than just a royal symbol. The diary contained detailed accounts of Diana's charitable work that Charles had never heard. She wrote about visiting AIDS patients in secret, holding dying children in her arms, comforting grieving families away from any cameras or publicity. These private acts of compassion revealed the depth of her calling to service. Met with a young mother whose son died from AIDS today. One entry read, she was so angry, so alone, convinced the world had forgotten her child. I held her while she cried, and I promised her that her son's life mattered, that his memory would be honored. These are the moments that make everything else worthwhile. Not the galas or the photo opportunities, but these quiet exchanges of human comfort. Charles realized that while he had been focused on traditional royal duties, state dinners, ceremonial appearances, constitutional responsibilities, Diana had been pioneering a new kind of royal service. She had used her position to bring attention to forgotten causes and comfort to marginalized people. Her approach had been revolutionary, and he had been too threatened by its success to appreciate its value. The entries about Diana's romantic relationships during this period were painful for Charles to read, but they also revealed her ongoing capacity for hope and love. She wrote about wanting to find a partner who could accept both her public role and her private self, someone who could love her completely, without being overwhelmed by royal complications. I dream of waking up next to someone who knows all of me, she had written. Not just the princess, not just the humanitarian, not just the mother, but all the pieces of who I am. Charles knew fragments of me, but he never seemed interested in the whole picture. Maybe that's what love really is, not just accepting someone's good qualities, but embracing their complexity. These words cut deep, because Charles knew they were true. He had loved aspects of Diana, her beauty, her maternal instincts, her public grace, but he had never taken time to understand her completely. He had been more interested in how she fit his life than in who she actually was. The diary also revealed Diana's ongoing concern for Charles's happiness, despite everything that had happened between them. She wrote about hoping he would find peace with Camilla, about wanting their children to have a father who was content with his choices. Saw Charles at Harry's school play today. One entry read. He looked tired, older than his years. I hope his relationship with Camilla brings him the happiness he couldn't find with me. Not because I forgive everything that happened, but because the boys need their father to be whole, and perhaps because, despite everything, I still care about his well-being. This generosity of spirit amazed Charles. Even after all the pain he had caused, Diana was capable of wishing him well. She understood that their children's happiness depended partly on his emotional health, and she was mature enough to put their needs ahead of her own hurt feelings. As Charles neared the end of the diary, the entries became more reflective, more philosophical. Diana wrote about lessons she had learned, mistakes she had made, hopes she held for the future. She seemed to be processing her entire adult life, trying to make sense of the extraordinary journey from shy teenager to global icon. I'm not the same person who married Charles all those years ago, she had written in one of her final entries. That girl was naive, romantic, desperate to please everyone. I'm grateful for her innocence, but I'm proud of the woman I've become. Strong enough to stand alone, wise enough to learn from pain, brave enough to keep loving despite the risks. Charles spent the following week avoiding the diary entirely. He threw himself into official duties, attended meetings he normally would have delegated, and stayed late at his office to avoid returning to Highgrove. But Diana's words haunted him, appearing in quiet moments when his guard was down. Her pain, her hope, her growing strength, all of it challenged everything he believed about their failed marriage. Finally, on a cold Thursday evening, he returned to her study. The diary lay exactly where he had left it, open to an entry from Harry's second birthday. Charles could see from the page that the entries were becoming longer, more detailed, as if Diana had been pouring her entire soul onto paper. The next section of the diary covered what Charles now recognized as the beginning of the end of their marriage. Diana wrote extensively about their public appearances, the strain of pretending to be happy while photographers captured every moment. The tour of Australia was torture, Diana had written. Smile, wave, make small talk, pretend Charles and I are madly in love. The crowd see what they want to see, a fairy tale romance. But behind the scenes, Charles barely speaks to me except to criticize my wardrobe or my interactions with officials. I feel like an actress playing a role I never auditioned for, in a play that will never end. Charles remembered that tour differently. He had been frustrated by the media's obsession with Diana, the way photographers ignored him completely to focus on her. He had felt diminished, unnecessary, watching his wife captivate crowds while he stood in her shadow. But reading her account now, he realized she had been suffering too, longing for genuine connection with him instead of the scripted interactions they shared in public. Diana's entries about their attempts at counseling were particularly revealing. Charles had agreed to marriage therapy reluctantly, viewing it as another obligation to fulfill. But Diana had approached it with desperate hope, believing they could finally address the issues destroying their relationship. The therapist asked us to share our deepest fears about the marriage, Diana had written. I talked about feeling invisible to Charles, about competing with a ghost from his past, about wanting to be truly known and loved. Charles spent the session discussing royal protocol and public perception. Even in therapy, he couldn't be honest about his feelings. How can you save a marriage when one person won't admit the marriage exists? Charles closed his eyes, remembering those uncomfortable sessions. He had been terrified of vulnerability, of admitting the depth of his love for Camilla or his confusion about his duty to Diana. So he had hidden behind formal language and royal concerns, never realizing that Diana was fighting for their survival while he was planning their dignified demise. The diary revealed Diana's growing awareness that their marriage was beyond saving. But rather than bitter anger, Her entries showed a woman trying to understand her husband's behavior, trying to find compassion even as her heart was breaking. "I think Charles married me because it was expected, not because he loved me," she had written. "And I married him because I was 19 and believed in fairy tales. We both entered this marriage for the wrong reasons, but only I'm fighting to make it right. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that he doesn't love me, but that he's incapable of trying to love me." These words hit Charles like physical blows. Diana had been far wiser at 25 than he had been at 35. She had seen clearly what he had been too cowardly to acknowledge. Their marriage had been built on duty and expectation, not love and compatibility. But the diary also revealed moments when Diana had glimpsed the man Charles could have been. She wrote about rare evenings when they talked honestly about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams for William and Harry. These entries glowed with warmth and hope, showing how much potential their relationship had possessed. "Charles told me about his lonely childhood tonight," one entry read. "How he felt invisible to his parents, how he learned to hide his emotions to avoid disappointment. For the first time, I understood why he struggles to show affection. He's not cold by nature. He's protecting himself from pain. I wished I could hold that frightened little boy and tell him he's safe with me." Charles felt tears streaming down his face as he read these words. Diana had understood him better than he had understood himself. She had seen past his defenses to the wounded child beneath, and she had wanted to heal those old hurts, but he had been too proud, too afraid to let her in. The entries about their separation were almost unbearable to read. Diana chronicled the formal negotiations, the lawyers' meetings, the careful division of their public duties. But between the practical details, she poured out her grief for the family she had dreamed of creating. "I keep thinking about the house we never shared," she had written, "not the palaces and official residences, but a real home where Charles and I could have been ourselves, where we could have raised the boys with laughter instead of protocol, where love could have grown from friendship and understanding. That house exists only in my imagination now, but it feels more real than any of the places I actually live." Charles had never known Diana dreamed of a simple life with him. During their marriage, he had assumed she loved the glamour and attention, the designer gowns and royal privileges. Now he realized she would have traded it all for genuine intimacy and partnership. The diary entries after their separation showed Diana's gradual healing and growth. She wrote about discovering her own strength, learning to make decisions without constantly seeking approval, finding joy in her work and her relationships with William and Harry. "I'm starting to remember who I was before I became a royal," she had written. "Not the naive teenager who married a prince, but the girl who loved dancing and helping people, who believed in kindness and authenticity. That girl is still inside me, stronger now for having survived this experience." But even as Diana grew more confident, her entries revealed ongoing pain about the failure of their marriage. She wrote about wanting to protect William and Harry from the worst of their parents' conflicts, about trying to speak respectfully of Charles in public while processing her private hurt. "The boys ask why Daddy doesn't live with us anymore," one entry read. "How do I explain that sometimes people can't make each other happy, no matter how much they try? I don't want them to lose faith in love because their parents couldn't find it together. Someday I hope they'll have the marriages Charles and I couldn't create." Charles realized that even in divorce, Diana had been more generous and mature than he had been. While he had focused on protecting his reputation and justifying his choices, she had been thinking about their children's emotional well-being and their future capacity for healthy relationships. The entries from Diana's dating period were particularly difficult for Charles to read. She wrote about tentative steps toward new relationships, about the fear that her royal status would forever complicate romantic connections, about wanting to be loved for herself rather than her title. "I met someone today who made me laugh," she had written about one relationship. "Really laugh the way I used to before everything became so complicated. It made me realize how long it's been since I felt genuinely joyful with a man. Charles and I had many things together, but we never had that easy laughter, that simple pleasure in each other's company." These words stung because Charles knew they were true. He and Diana had shared passion, duty, parenthood, and public service, but they had rarely shared uncomplicated happiness. Their relationship had been weighted down with expectations and histories that prevented the light-hearted connection Diana craved. The final section of Diana's diary contained entries from the last months of her life, and Charles approached these pages with trembling hands. He knew these would be the most difficult words to read, written by a woman who had found her strength and purpose, but was still searching for lasting love and peace. Diana's entries from early 1997 showed a woman at a crossroads. She wrote about feeling ready for a new chapter in her life, about wanting to step back from some royal responsibilities while expanding her humanitarian work. Her confidence was evident in every line, but so was her ongoing struggle to balance public duty with private happiness. "I'm 46 years old, and I finally know who I am," she had written that spring. Not the shy kindergarten teacher who married a prince, not the bitter divorcee the tabloids love to write about, but a woman who has learned to use her pain to help others heal. "I want the next phase of my life to be about building something lasting, relationships, causes, a legacy that goes beyond headlines and photographs." Charles could see in these entries that Diana had been planning significant changes in her life. She wrote about wanting to live part-time abroad, to work with international charities to give William and Harry more normal childhoods away from constant media scrutiny. She had been thinking strategically about how to maintain her influence while creating more personal freedom. But the diary also revealed Diana's ongoing loneliness, despite her public success and growing confidence. She wrote about the difficulty of forming authentic relationships when surrounded by people who wanted to use her fame for their own purposes. "Had dinner with friends tonight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was performing rather than relaxing," one entry read. "Everyone wants to hear royal gossip or get advice about their charity events. Sometimes I wonder if anyone really sees me as just Diana, not the princess, not the humanitarian icon, just a woman who wants to laugh with friends and share ordinary moments." These words reminded Charles of similar feelings he had experienced throughout his own life. The isolation of royal status was something they had shared, but they had never been able to comfort each other through it. Instead, their mutual loneliness had driven them further apart, each seeking understanding in different places. Diana's entries about her relationship with Dodi Fayed revealed a woman cautiously opening her heart again. She wrote about enjoying his attentiveness and warmth, but also about her fears that media pressure would destroy this relationship as it had damaged so many others. "Dodi makes me feel cherished in ways I had forgotten were possible," she had written just weeks before her death. "He listens when I talk, remembers small details about my preferences, treats me like a woman rather than a public figure. But I worry about the attention our relationship is attracting. The photographers are more aggressive than ever, and I fear what this scrutiny might do to something so new and fragile." Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions reading about Diana's happiness with another man. Part of him was genuinely glad she had found affection and attention after years of being alone. But part of him also felt regret that he had never been able to give her the uncomplicated devotion she craved. The diary revealed Diana's ongoing concerns about William and Harry as they navigated their teenage years. She wrote extensively about trying to prepare them for their royal futures while protecting their emotional well-being. "William is becoming so serious, so focused on duty and responsibility," one entry observed. "He reminds me of Charles at that age, all honor and obligation but forgetting to leave room for joy. I worry that he's learning to hide his feelings the way his father did. Harry is more open, more willing to show vulnerability, but he's also more reckless. Both boys are reacting to our divorce in their own ways, and I blame myself for not protecting them from our adult failures." These maternal concerns touched Charles deeply. Diana had been thinking about their son's psychological development in ways that had never occurred to him. While he focused on their royal education and public preparation, she had been worried about their capacity for happiness and healthy relationships. The final entries in the diary, written just days before the fatal car crash in Paris, showed Diana in a reflective mood. She seemed to be taking stock of her life, evaluating her choices and relationships with unusual clarity. "I've been thinking about forgiveness lately," she had written in one of her last entries. "Not just forgiving others, but forgiving myself for the mistakes I've made. I married Charles for the wrong reasons, but I gave that marriage everything I had. I couldn't save it, but I learned from it. I couldn't change Charles, but I changed myself. Maybe that's enough." These words devastated Charles. Diana had been ready to forgive him, to move beyond the bitterness that had defined their post-divorce relationship. She had reached a place of peace about their failed marriage, understanding both his limitations and her own growth. But he had never known about this evolution in her thinking, had never had the chance to respond to her generosity. The very last entry in the diary was dated just 3 days before Diana's death. She had written it after returning from a charity event, and it captured both her exhaustion with public life and her determination to continue her meaningful work. Another evening of smiling and making small talk with wealthy donors, she had written, "Sometimes I feel like a trained performer, hitting all the right notes to keep the money flowing to good causes. But then I remember the children in the hospitals, the families dealing with AIDS, the communities torn apart by landmines. If my celebrity can save even one life, then all the performance is worthwhile. I just wish I could do this work without sacrificing so much privacy and normalcy." Charles closed the diary and sat in Diana's chair for a long time, overwhelmed by everything he had learned. The woman revealed in these pages was far more complex, wise and generous than he had ever understood. During their marriage or in the years following their divorce, he realized that while he had been focused on protecting the monarchy's reputation and maintaining traditional protocols, Diana had been pioneering a new kind of royal service. She had understood instinctively what he was only now beginning to grasp, that the modern monarchy's survival depended on genuine connection with people, not distant dignity, but beyond her public evolution. The diary had revealed Diana's private journey from wounded young bride to confident woman. She had taken responsibility for her own mistakes while still holding him accountable for his. She had found ways to transform her pain into compassion for others, her loneliness into empathy for the isolated and forgotten. Most painfully, Charles realized that Diana had been ready to forgive him, to move beyond their shared history of hurt and disappointment. She had reached a place of understanding about their incompatibility, while still believing in the possibility of healing and growth. But she had died before he had evolved enough to accept her forgiveness or offer his own apologies. The room felt charged with Diana's presence as Charles absorbed the full weight of her final entries. She had been planning for the future, thinking about positive changes in her work and relationships, believing that her best years were still ahead. Her death had cut short not just a life, but a transformation that might have changed everything for both of them and their children. Charles found himself wondering what might have happened if he had read these entries years earlier, if Diana had felt safe enough to share these thoughts with him directly. Would he have been mature enough to hear her truths? Could they have found a way to be better partners even if they couldn't be happy spouses? The questions tortured him because he knew the answers. Diana had tried to communicate these feelings during their marriage, but he had been too defensive and frightened to really listen. She had offered him chances to understand her perspective, but he had been too invested in being right to consider that he might be wrong. Now, sitting surrounded by her belongings and her words, Charles felt the full impact of what they had both lost. Not just their marriage, but the friendship they might have built from its ashes. Not just their personal happiness, but the example they might have set for William and Harry about resilience, forgiveness, and growth. The diary had shown him that Diana's final years had been about more than moving on from their failed marriage. She had been building a new version of herself, one that integrated all her experiences into wisdom and compassion. She had been becoming the woman she was always meant to be, free from the constraints of trying to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. Charles realized that this was Diana's final gift to him, not just the revelation of her private thoughts, but the example of her personal evolution. She had shown him how to transform pain into purpose, how to use failure as a foundation for growth, how to love more deeply because of having lost love before. As evening fell outside Diana's study, Charles made a decision that would have seemed impossible when he first opened the diary. He would share what he had learned, not publicly, but with the people who mattered most. He would talk to William and Harry about their mother's wisdom, her strength, her capacity for forgiveness. He would try to honor her memory, not just through formal tributes, but by becoming the man she had always believed he could be. The diary had brought Diana back to life for him, not as the troubled young woman he had married or the bitter ex-wife he had divorced, but as the complete human being she had become. And in seeing her fully for the first time, Charles finally understood what love should be, not possession or compatibility, but witness and support for another person's becoming. 2 weeks had passed since Charles finished reading Diana's diary, and the knowledge it contained had changed everything about how he moved through the world. He carried her words with him constantly, finding himself pausing during official engagements to consider what Diana would have done, how she would have connected with the people he was meeting. The first person he decided to tell was William. They met for a private dinner at Clarence's house away from staff and protocol. Charles had chosen the informal setting carefully, remembering Diana's entries about wanting her sons to experience ordinary family moments. As they sat across from each other in the small dining room, Charles felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since William was a child. "I found something that belonged to your mother," Charles began carefully, watching his son's face for any sign of discomfort. "A diary she kept throughout our marriage and afterward. I think you should know what she wrote about you, about all of us." William's reaction surprised him. Instead of the wariness Charles expected, his son's face showed immediate interest and something that looked like relief. "I've always wondered what she really thought about everything that happened," William said quietly. "The public version was so different from what I saw at home. Sometimes I felt like I was protecting a memory that might not have been real." Charles spent the next 2 hours sharing carefully chosen excerpts from Diana's diary, focusing on her love for her sons, her hopes for their futures, and her wisdom about family and relationships. He watched William's face transform as he heard his mother's private thoughts, seeing recognition and understanding replace years of confusion and hurt. "She knew exactly who we were," William said finally, tears in his eyes. "Not just the princes, but William and Harry. She saw our real personalities and loved us completely. I'd forgotten how much she understood about what we needed." When Charles met with Harry a few days later, the conversation was more emotional and less controlled. Harry had always worn his feelings more openly, and learning about Diana's private thoughts broke down defenses he had built over decades. "She wrote about me?" Harry asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What did she say about the angry kid who kept getting in trouble?" Charles shared Diana's entries about Harry's sensitive nature, her understanding that his rebelliousness came from deep feeling rather than carelessness, her belief that his emotional openness would be his greatest strength as an adult. "She called you her warrior poet," Charles told his younger son. "She said you felt everything so deeply that you had to learn to fight or be overwhelmed by the world's pain. She was proud of your courage even when it got you into trouble." Harry broke down completely then, sobbing for the mother who had understood him so completely, but had died before he was old enough to appreciate her wisdom. Charles found himself holding his grown son the way Diana might have, offering comfort without trying to fix or control the emotion. These conversations with his sons transformed Charles's understanding of his role as their father. For years he had focused on preparing them for royal duty, emphasizing responsibility and protocol. But Diana's diary had shown him that what they needed most was emotional security and unconditional acceptance. Charles also made an unexpected decision to reach out to some of Diana's closest friends, people he had avoided for years because they reminded him of his failures as a husband. He met with each of them privately, sharing selected passages from the diary and asking about their memories of Diana during her final years. She talked about forgiveness constantly toward the end. One friend told him, "Not just forgiving you, but forgiving herself for the choices she made." She said she wanted to model healing for William and Harry, to show them that people could grow beyond their mistakes. Another friend shared that Diana had spoken about Charles with increasing compassion in her final months. She said she finally understood that you were both victims of expectations that were impossible to meet. She hoped that someday you would find the courage to be vulnerable enough to really love someone. These conversations were painful, but necessary. They filled in gaps in Charles's understanding of Diana's final evolution, showing him a woman who had found peace with their shared history while still working to heal its wounds. Perhaps the most difficult conversation was with Camilla. Charles had been reluctant to share Diana's words with the woman who had been the source of so much conflict, but Diana's diary had convinced him that honesty was essential for moving forward. "She wrote about you," Charles told Camilla during a quiet evening at home, "about understanding why I loved you, about hoping our relationship would make me happy enough to be a better father to William and Harry." Camilla listened in silence as Charles shared Diana's surprisingly generous thoughts about their relationship. Diana had written that while she could never forgive the betrayal, she understood the genuine love between Charles and Camilla, and hoped it would lead to healing rather than continued bitterness. "She was extraordinary," Camilla said finally, "more generous than I had any right to expect. I wish I could thank her for that gift." The diary had also changed how Charles approached his royal duties. He began incorporating Diana's methods into his own work, spending more time with individuals rather than rushing through ceremonial obligations, asking personal questions and really listening to the answers, using his position to highlight causes that mattered rather than simply maintaining tradition. During a visit to a homeless shelter, Charles found himself sitting on the floor with a young mother, listening to her story with the kind of attention Diana had given to everyone she met. The woman's face lit up with surprise and gratitude at being truly seen by someone in his position. This is what she meant, Charles thought as he held the woman's baby while she filled out paperwork for housing assistance. This is how you use royal privilege to create human connection. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Charles began reaching out to old friends he had neglected, expressing feelings he had previously kept hidden, allowing himself to be more vulnerable in his relationships. Diana's example of emotional courage inspired him to take risks with his own heart. Most importantly, the diary had given Charles a roadmap for honoring Diana's memory in ways that went beyond formal tributes. Every time he chose compassion over protocol, connection over distance, growth over defensiveness, he was continuing the work she had started. On the anniversary of Diana's death, Charles returned to her study one final time. He placed the diary back in its drawer, but he carried its lessons in his heart. As he stood at the window looking out at the gardens she had loved, he felt her presence not as a source of guilt or regret, but as an inspiration for becoming the man she had always believed he could be. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty room, "for seeing who I could become even when I couldn't see it myself, for loving our son so completely, for showing me what real strength looks like, for forgiving me before I was wise enough to ask for forgiveness." The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the space that had held Diana's most private thoughts. Charles felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in decades, knowing that while he couldn't change the past, he could honor her memory by living more authentically, loving more deeply, and serving with the genuine compassion she had modeled throughout her extraordinary life. Diana's diary had been her final gift to him, not just the revelation of her thoughts, but the inspiration to become worthy of the forgiveness she had already granted. And in accepting that gift, Charles finally understood what she had tried to teach him all along, that love isn't about being perfect for someone else, but about being brave enough to grow into your best self, even when it's too late to save what you once had.